He was an alpha king who had not smiled in 100 years. That was what they said anyway. That was the whisper that moved through the stone halls of Vorath Keep, like a draught beneath a door, that King Leofric, Alpha King of the 5 northern territories, Lord of the blood-red banner and the wolf throne, had not felt the bond, had not smiled, had not been warm, since the night the curse had settled over his bloodline like a second skin. 100 years was not a literal span. He was not that old. But the curse was. It had eaten through his grandfather's line and his father's line, and now it had come to him, the last of the Vorath kings, and it had taken everything it always took: the mate bond, the warmth in the chest, where a wolf's recognition was supposed to live, the golden fire behind the eyes that every pack wolf described when they first saw their fated one. Leofric had none of it. His eyes were the color of deep winter ice, and they stayed that way. Always. Marin had heard all of this in pieces, the way a person hears things they are not supposed to hear, through cracked doors, over the sound of scrubbing water, in the pauses between orders being barked at her in the great kitchen of Aldenmore Estate. She was not supposed to be here at all. Not at Vorath Keep. Not in the selection. The selection was the name given to the ritual by which the Alpha King's court chose a tribute from each of the 5 territories. One woman, unmarked and unspoken for, presented before the king in the hope that the bond would finally stir. That was the word they used, tribute. As though she were a tax, a tithe, a cask of grain wheeled to a storehouse. Aldenmore's tribute was supposed to be a lord's daughter, a woman with breeding and lineage and an embroidered gown. Not Marin. Not a girl who slept in the servants' corridor and woke before dawn to light fires, and who had spent the better part of her 22 years learning to make herself very, very small. But the lord's daughter had developed a fever the morning of the departure, and Lady Corvin had looked at Marin across the length of the kitchen with the flat eyes of a woman doing arithmetic. And that had been that. "You'll do," Lady Corvin had said. "You're pretty enough when you're not covered in ash. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look at anyone directly. And for the love of everything old, do not embarrass this house." Marin had stood very still and said nothing, and thought about how she was, in Lady Corvin's estimation, a warm body with a passable face, and how that had been the sum total of her value her entire life. She had one dress. It was borrowed, a pale grey wool gown with a belt of braided cord that had belonged to a housemaid who had left the estate 3 seasons ago. The hem dragged slightly on her left side. The sleeves were long, which suited Marin well, because long sleeves covered the thin white scars that ran up the inside of her left forearm from the kitchen hearth accident that had not entirely been an accident 3 winters past. She had copper-dark hair, the deep red-brown of old embers, and she wore it pinned at the back of her neck, because she had no pins fine enough to do anything more. Her eyes were an unusual shade, storm grey with a ring of amber near the iris that seemed to catch even low candlelight and hold it. Her face was fine-boned, with high cheekbones and a mouth that tended toward quiet. She was not tall. She was not imposing. She was the kind of beautiful that people overlooked because she moved like someone who had long since learned that being seen was dangerous. The 5 tributes rode in a covered cart from Aldenmore to Vorath Keep, and none of the other 4 women spoke to Marin. She did not blame them. She pressed her back to the wooden slats and watched the frost-grey hills roll past the gap in the canvas, and tried to feel nothing about where she was going. The curse, she told herself, was not her problem to solve. Vorath Keep was everything the stories said, and worse. It was built into the face of a granite ridge, 7 towers connected by walls the colour of old bone, and the gatehouse alone was tall enough to swallow the entirety of Aldenmore Estate. Torches burned in iron brackets along every visible wall, despite the grey afternoon light. The banners, blood red, with a black wolf silhouette at the centre, hung perfectly still in air that should have moved them. The tributes were received by a woman named Lady Serath, who was the king's seneschal, and who looked at all 5 of them with the expression of a woman cataloguing livestock. She walked the line twice, pausing at each face, and when she reached Marin, she stopped. "What estate?" "Aldenmore, my lady. Lord Corvin's house." Serath's eyes dropped briefly to the hem of Marin's borrowed gown. "You're the substitute." It was not a question. "Yes, my lady." A long pause. Serath moved on without another word, but one of the other tributes, a dark-eyed woman in ivory silk named Diver, who had the practiced composure of someone born to high houses, caught Marin's eye and let her lip curl. Just slightly. Enough to say what she thought of substitutes. Marin looked away. The tributes were given chambers in the eastern tower. Marin's was the smallest, naturally, a stone room with a narrow window and a single candle and a bed that was perfectly adequate and which she stared at for a long time because she had not slept in a bed with a proper frame in 4 years. The presentation ceremony was to occur that evening in the great hall. Marin sat on the edge of the bed frame and repinned her hair and told herself that Leofric would look at Deva or one of the other proper tributes, and the bond either would or would not stir. And either way Marin would be sent home to Aldenmore and the kitchen and the ash, and that would be the end of it. She tried to make herself believe it. The great hall was lit by 100 candles in a wheel of iron chandeliers, and by the long line of torches in their wall brackets, and it was filled with more people than Marin had ever seen in one room. Lords and their wives, senior pack members in formal tunics, court officials in long dark robes, all of them arranged in precise social order, and all of them watching the 5 tributes walk the length of the hall toward the dais at the far end. Marin kept her eyes down. She counted her own footsteps. She smelled beeswax and pine resin and the particular cold mineral scent of very old stone. And then she smelled something else. Something underneath the candle smoke and the crowd, something she had no name for, clean and dark, like rain striking warm earth, like the first breath of air after a window is opened in a sealed room. She did not look up. She should have. King Leofric stood at the far end of the hall, and he did not move as the tributes walked toward him. He was exactly as described, and nothing like she had imagined. Tall, considerably more than most of the men present, broad through the shoulder in the way that spoke of a body built by something older than training. He wore dark wool and a chain of office across his chest, heavy silver links against black fabric, and his hair was dark and close-cropped, and his face was— striking was the wrong word. Austere was closer, a face that had been arranged by some long-ago force into an expression of permanent, contained stillness, and had stayed there. His eyes were ice-grey. They moved across the line of tributes, with the dispassion of a man completing a duty he did not expect to yield results. Marin felt them pass over her, and she kept her chin level, and breathed carefully through her nose. The ceremony was formal. Each tribute was presented by name and estate. They stepped forward, inclined their heads, stepped back. Leofric said nothing. His face changed nothing, until Marin. "Marin of Aldenmore," Serath announced, and Marin stepped forward and inclined her head, and she was already beginning to step back when she heard it. A sound she had never heard from a person before. A low, involuntary sound that was not quite a breath, and not quite anything else, and that came from the direction of the dais, and made every person in the hall go absolutely silent. She looked up. Leofric's eyes were no longer ice-grey. They were gold, not amber, not hazel. Gold, pure, burning, impossible gold, the colour of a torch flame held very close, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that stopped her breath like a hand pressed to her sternum. She heard the murmur move through the hall. She heard Deva's sharp intake of breath from somewhere to her left. She saw the muscles in Leofric's jaw tighten, and his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curl slowly into fists. No one spoke. Then Leofric said very quietly, in a voice that carried through the silence like a blade through still water, "Step forward." It was directed at her, only at her. Marin stepped forward. What happened next happened fast, and then very slowly, and then fast again. Fast. Lady Dava's hand closed around Marin's arm above the elbow, before she had taken 2 steps, fingers digging in with a grip that was entirely deliberate and entirely painful. And Dava said, very softly, so that only Marin could hear, "I don't know what you've done to make his eyes do that, substitute, but it ends here." Slowly. Marin tried to free her arm. She tried calmly, because she had learned long ago that the calm approach was the only one that did not make things worse. And Dava's grip tightened, and she was pulled sharply to the side, and her heel caught the edge of the stone step, and she went down hard, one knee striking the floor, one hand catching her fall against the base of the nearest torch bracket, and the bracket's iron edge was not forgiving. She felt the cut before she felt the pain, a clean, sharp line across the heel of her palm, then the pain, then the blood, small but real, a dark line of copper-scented warmth across her skin. The hall was still full of people. They saw all of it. Some of them laughed, a short, cruel sound from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, quickly cut off when the atmosphere of the room changed without warning. Changed was not the right word. It broke. Fast again. Leofric moved. He moved the way Marin had heard wolves described in old accounts, not like a man crossing a room, but like the room had contracted around him. And then he was no longer on the dais, and he was no longer at a distance, and he was between Marin and Daiva, with his back to Marin and the full weight of whatever he was, Alpha King, apex predator, the last of the Vorath blood, directed at Daiva like a wall of pressurized cold air. Daiva released Marin's arm. The room released its breath. Leofric did not look back at Marin immediately. He stood very still and looked at Daiva, and when he spoke, his voice was the quietest it had been all evening, and that made it the most dangerous thing in the hall. "Touch her again," he said, "and I will remove you from this keep in pieces." Daiva's composure shattered. She took 2 steps back. Her face had gone the color of old linen. Then Leofric turned, and he looked at Marin on the floor, and something moved across his face that had no political name, something old and ungovernable, and entirely at odds with the composed, cold king the court had watched for years. He lowered himself to one knee beside her on the stone floor, and the hall made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, something stunned and collective and irreversible. "Give me your hand," he said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "It's not serious." I did not ask whether it was serious. His gold eyes were still gold. They had not faded. "Give me your hand." She gave him her hand. His fingers closed around her wrist, with a gentleness so complete and so careful that it hit her somewhere behind the sternum, like a tuning fork struck against stone. He looked at the cut. He looked at it for a long time. His jaw was tight, and his breathing was controlled in the way that spoke of a person applying significant force of will to a significant internal pressure. Then he stood, and he did not release her wrist, and he said, loudly now, to the entire hall, to every witness in their precise social order, to the whole of the court and the lords and the officials in their dark robes, "The selection is concluded." A pause. "She is my mate. She is your queen." The healer's name was Brother Oswin, a compact older man with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades being trusted with broken things. He examined Marin's hand in Leofric's private receiving chamber, while Leofric stood at the far wall and watched with the stillness of a man under restraint. "Small cut," Oswin said. "Clean. No lasting damage." He began to bind it in soft linen. "You've had worse." It was said simply, an observation, and it was true, and Marin said nothing, but she made the mistake of pushing her left sleeve slightly up to allow a better binding angle, and Oswin stopped. He looked at her forearm, at the thin white lines, more than one, a pattern that did not belong to accident. Marin pulled her sleeve down. The silence lasted 3 seconds. She heard the sound Leofric made from across the room before she turned to look at him. It was low, and it was controlled, and it was the worst sound she had heard him make, because it was not anger in the normal sense. It was something far older than anger, something that came from the part of a wolf that existed before language and before law, and it said something very specific about what he intended. "How long?" he said, very quiet, very still. "It doesn't matter." "How long?" She looked at him. The gold had not left his eyes. There was something else in them now, too, something she had spent her whole life being denied, and therefore could not immediately name. When she did name it finally, it sat in her chest like an ember in ash. Grief. He was looking at her with grief. 4 years, she said. Leofric was silent for a moment that lasted longer than moments should. Then he turned to Oswin and said, "Leave us." Oswin left without a word. When they were alone, Leofric crossed the room and sat on the bench across from her, and looked at her properly for the first time, not across the length of a hall, not over the chaos of an interrupted ceremony, but here, in the candlelight, close enough that she could see the precise shade of gold his eyes had become, and the thin, pale scar that ran from his left temple toward his jaw, and the tension that lived in every line of his face, and that she now understood was not coldness. It was control, 100 years of it, of a curse made bearable by the decision not to feel. "The bond doesn't wake in our line," he said. "That's what we are told. That's what the curse means." "I know." It woke. He said it simply, factually, as a man reports the thing he has just witnessed with his own eyes, unable to dispute it. "When I saw you. When I—" He stopped. He looked at his own hands briefly. "When your blood reached me. Something broke. Something inside me that I had believed was simply absent." Marin watched him. "I don't know what I am to you," she said carefully. "I was a substitute. I was not even supposed to be here. I know what you are to me." He looked up. His voice was entirely level. "The question is what I am to you. And I understand that the answer to that question requires time that I owe you, and evidence I have not yet given you, and patience I have no right to ask for. I understand all of that." A pause. The gold in his eyes was steady and very warm. "I'm asking anyway." Marin looked at the candle between them. She looked at the borrowed dress and the linen-wrapped hand, and the 100 reasons why the sensible answer was no, and the reason underneath all of those reasons, the single small stubborn warmth she had felt when his fingers closed around her wrist, and she thought about 4 years in a kitchen and long sleeves, and making herself small enough to survive. "Ask me again in a month," she said, "after I've decided whether I believe you." Something happened in his face, something quiet and enormous. "Agreed," he said. Outside, in the great hall, she could hear the court beginning to find its voice again, the sound of a world rearranging itself around an event it had not planned for, the sound of 100 years of waiting, ending. Marin kept looking at the candle. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel afraid. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of being seen, not used, not substituted, not overlooked, seen, and that, she thought, was a beginning,